However, because the vessel has moved in the water, the buoyancy force, which is the force of the water pushing back up on, because they've shifted the centre of gravity outwards, they've increased the righting moment, meaning that the vessel will actually start to come back upright. My name's Stuart, RWA Yachtmaster, Ocean Examiner and Instructor. I've been working within the industry for over 20 years. But tonight we're going to talk about stability. And first of all, we want to think about what is stability. Well, stability is a vessel's ability to return to its home position. Now that is, if you've got a vessel here upright and it gets heeled over, how does it get back to here? And that's what we're going to look at this evening. Now, there's various points or various parts of the whole kind of stability topic. I'm not going to read out all these different points we're going to talk through. If you've been looking at the screen, you've obviously probably just had a little read. But that's what we're going to learn about. We're going to learn about all the different aspects of stability this evening. Now, the main factors of stability, they're generally decided upon the design of a vessel. So before the vessel is even built, that specific vessel will probably already start to have the main core of its stability book already written, because it's done during the design stage. However, even for us going out on the vessel at whatever level we're at, whether we're just going out as crew, or we're skippering the vessel, or we're taking paying customers on board, it's super important that we do understand some of the aspects to stability. The further up that chain we go, the more we want to understand. Now, there's two main ways that we can look at stability. That is transverse and longitudinal. Transverse is when the vessel kind of heels from side to side, and longitudinal is when it goes fore and aft. Transverse is known as heel, and that's what we're going to focus on this evening. Longitudinal is known as trim, and that's maybe more relevant for power vessels, but is still a factor for all vessels. And what you'll then learn to see is that stability is the interaction between mass and buoyancy. And we can just take those 2 points as separate, mass and buoyancy. Mass is essentially, excuse if I don't say the correct engineering term here, but mass is essentially the point at which all the weight of the vessel acts through. And we'll think of that as the center of gravity. And buoyancy is the force exerted on the water that is pushing up by the displacement of the vessel. So when the vessel sits in the water, it displaces a volume of water, and the force that the water pushes back up on the vessel is known as the buoyancy. That's what keeps our vessel upright. We can then think of buoyancy as acting as a force upwards, vertically upwards, and our weight acting through our center of gravity as a force downwards, as all gravitational forces will act. What then happens is our vessel heels over. This is that longitudinal side of it. And as soon as a vessel heels, our center of gravity stays exactly where it is, because it's still the vessel weight hasn't changed. We've not changed the weight of the vessel. So the center of gravity is still the same, and it still acts downwards. However, because the vessel has moved in the water, the buoyancy force, which is the force of the water pushing back up on the vessel, has moved. Before, they were acting in a vertical line. They were in kind of like their home position, like a state of equilibrium. Now that the vessel has heeled over, the buoyancy force has moved as a result of the shape of the boat. And what that's done is it's created a righting moment. And the distance between where the center of gravity is acting, the center of buoyancy is acting, is known as the GZ. But for us, what we're more concerned about is what that's doing, and it's creating a righting moment. And so if you look at the red arrow going downwards for gravity and the blue arrow going upwards for buoyancy, they're trying to act together to turn the vessel upright again. And so that's known as our righting moment. The moment is it's a combination of the size of that buoyancy force and the distance it is away from the center of gravity. So that's that kind of GZ distance. As we keep leaning the vessel over, that righting moment changes, because at each angle of heel, the buoyancy force is acting through a different point. And so the righting moment changes in force. So as the buoyancy moves away from the center of gravity, our righting moment gets bigger. And then eventually, as our vessel keeps tipping over, our buoyancy comes back towards our center of gravity and the righting moment gets smaller. Now, what we can do is we can graph that out, and we can kind of plot this on a graph. And our basic stability graphs are plotted with our righting moment on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and our angle of heel along the horizontal axis, the x-axis. And I'll just very quickly run through each of these little diagrams. So the first one we've got buoyancy and gravity, they're acting in the same plane, so there's no righting moment. As soon as there's a little bit of heel, the righting moment increases until there's more heel, and it increases until there's even more heel, and that righting moment becomes its maximum. As the vessel keeps heeling, the buoyancy force comes back towards, and so the righting moment decreases until, as you can see, the pink line here goes back through the angle of heel, and we end up with a negative righting moment. And on the second to last diagram on the right here, you can maybe see that the vessel's almost upside down. Gravity's now here and buoyancy's here. And so they're working with each other to try and turn the vessel upside down now. And that's where this kind of right-hand bit of this purple-pink curve is actually a negative righting moment. So the force is negative because it's trying to actually turn our vessel upside down, which is obviously something we do not want. Now, just looking at that curve on its own, we've got it here. If it's got a positive righting moment as it goes upwards, as angle of heel increases, it starts to drop down. It goes through a righting moment of 0, and then it has a negative righting moment. So that's essentially for 180 degrees of an angle of heel. So as the angle of heel of that vessel increases, righting moment increases until somewhere probably beyond 90 degrees, that righting moment probably becomes 0, and then it becomes negative. And what that actually does is it makes our vessel want to stay upside down and become stable upside down. So what does that mean? We'll get to that in a second. First of all, just that point where we lose a positive righting moment and we get a negative righting moment, that is known as our AVS, which is our angle of vanishing stability. And it kind of does what it says on the tin. It's a point at which we lose stability of our vessel. So as I said right at the start, the stability is a measure of a boat's ability to return to its home position, its upright position. So yeah, you heel it over to here, the righting moment brings it upright. You heel it over to here, the righting moment brings it upright. You heel it over to here, oh, the righting moment is not there anymore. It actually turns it upside down.
As Stu, with that curve, it's a hand-drawn curve, but that second part of it, the negative part of the curve, is a lot smaller and shallower than the positive side of the curve, which I'm guessing is sort of like a reassuring aspect.
Yeah. So not all vessels will have the exact same stability curve. This is just a typical one for a fin-keeled sailing vessel. Yeah, in the right-hand part of that curve where we have a negative righting moment, our vessel wants to turn fully upside down. But it wouldn't take much to heel the vessel back to a point where the righting moment actually becomes positive and it would come back upright again. I've not measured it on this graph, but you could almost imagine that the AVS there is about 130 degrees. So you'd only have to turn your vessel by about 50 degrees and suddenly it would just pop upright again. It's not that you'd have to turn your vessel fully the correct way over. Now, sticking with that kind of train of thought, what we've got here is that showing how the area under this stability curve is a measure of the force required to generate that angle of heel. So the little blue bit, first of all, if you worked out the area of that blue hatched area, that is the force required to get to 35 degrees angle of heel. If you wanted to get to 70 degrees angle of heel, you're going to need the whole of the blue area and the whole of the red hatched area. So it's maybe not massively clear, but for those who just kind of do a little bit of quick maths in their head, essentially that red bit is almost twice as big as the blue bit. So you're kind of needing 3 times the force to create twice the angle of heel. Now, that's not like a rule of thumb or anything. That's just a rough estimation on this curve for this vessel. And it just says how much more force is required to get to that extra angle of heel. And you could look at it even less. If we only wanted to get to an angle of heel of 10 degrees, it wouldn't take much force to get us there. But then to get to 20, 30, it's always increasing. So the force required, it's not a linear amount. It's not like, oh, 10 knots will lean us over at 15 degrees, which means 20 knots will lean us over at 30 degrees. It might be something like 10 knots does lean you over at 15 degrees, but actually you need 40 or 50 knots to lean over to 30 degrees. So it's kind of, you need an exponential force, basically. The force needs to be greater and greater to create more of an angle of heel, which is really good for us because we don't really want to be heeling over. And we certainly don't want to be getting to the point where we heel over so much that we pass our AVS, our angle of vanishing stability, where we lose stability and we lose that ability for our vessel to return to its home position, and we would become a vessel stable upside down. Now, just before we go, we'll come back to that graph in a little bit. Just want to think about why different vessels might have different stability curves. Now, I could have pulled real stability curves here, but I thought it's kind of nice to just look at 2 simple examples and compare how different they are. And what we've got here is we've got the red boat and red curve for a nice, wide, shallow, drafted vessel. And we've got the blue boat and the blue curve for a narrow, deep drafted vessel. And what you might start to look at that, you'll see, oh, wow, the stability curve is really high on the red boat and really low on the blue one. So the red boat is so much safer. But the AVS on the red boat is so much lower than the blue boat. The blue boat's AVS is, it's way up there at like 145, 150 degrees. If we said the end of where they come back up to the zero righting moment is 180. So yes, it might not take too much force to heel that blue boat over, but it needs a lot of force to get to the AVS. If we look at the 2 right-hand bits of the curve where there's the negative righting moment, the area under the blue bit, or the area between that blue smile and the horizontal axis, is a tiny little area, whereas the red one is much bigger. And what that means is if your vessel was upside down, then it doesn't need that much force to actually create that little bit of heel, at which point the righting moment would become positive and it would bring your vessel upright again. Whereas the red vessel is still going to need a much larger force to act upon it to get an upside down vessel back into a position that it wants to turn upright again.
But he has got a much bigger smile.
But he's got a much bigger smile.
I wouldn't have used that phrase for being capsized, Stu.
That's true. That was maybe. It's maybe the wrong analogy for it. And this just shows you again the area under the curve, and the force required to get to a certain angle of heel. So the two different vessels there are narrow, deep drafted, and our shallow, wide vessel. They're both to get to 45 degrees angle of heel. The blue bit is the force required for the narrow vessel, and the red and the blue hatched areas is the force required for the wider vessel. Absolutely much more force is required to create that angle of heel, but the overall stability of the blue vessel is greater, because even if it did end up upside down, it would only need a tiny little force to act on it to turn it back upright again. What this is also known as is initial and ultimate. So the blue vessel has greater ultimate stability because its AVS is higher, and that negative righting moment area is really small. Whereas the red vessel has really good initial stability because it takes so much force to create any angle of heel, but its AVS is relatively low, and it needs a fair amount of force to turn it from an upside down position back upright. Now, moving on from that kind of learning about the stability curve, one of the things that they use in the whole design process is the metacenter, and that's a measure of the initial stability, what I was just kind of discussing in the previous slide there. And basically what they do is they tilt the vessel, or they pretend to tilt the vessel to 10, 15 degrees, absolute maximum, and they'll do it at the same angle. And the point at which the buoyancy force goes upwards and meets the vertical line that would go through the verticalness of the vessel from the center of gravity, that would become the height of your metacenter. And the higher that metacenter point would be, then the greater the initial stability. So if you imagine that was a wider vessel, that little purple dot at the metacenter would move up to the right, and it would say it's got a better initial stability. And if the metacenter moved down to the left, that would be more common with a narrower drafted vessel, and that would be a poorer initial stability. However, the higher the metacenter, the smaller the period of roll. And the smaller the period of roll, the more uncomfortable a vessel is. So it's not just a case of saying, let's make our vessel wide, let's make it wide, let's make it super stable, because it can actually then affect the period of the roll of the vessel, of how it acts on the waves. And if it has a really small period, that is, it's going to roll like that very quickly, it's not going to be comfortable. Whereas, yeah, something with the metacenter lower down, it will roll much slower, it will stay upright a bit more, and so it's more comfortable. So yeah, it's not quite as simple as just saying, let's have better stability, or let's have better initial stability, let's have better ultimate. Everything's got to be taken into account. There's no such thing as, well, there probably is, but there's no such thing as bad stability, or my stability is better than your stability. It's about their uses, their vessels' use, where they might go, and the waters in which they might sail. And so that's where all these calculations come in, and the metacenter is a factor that they use to create that. And this just kind of touches on that a little bit more. Roll. Wider vessels will typically follow the wave, and so these vessels, they're just following the wave, and the wider one has got a much greater angle of heel on, so it's creating more roll, whereas narrower vessels, they tend to stay upright, especially if they've got deeper keels, and they'll create less roll. And that's just all about comfort. Less roll, more comfort. And so, yeah, another great example of why, let's just have a modern 45-foot big wide cruising vessel. Well, if we're going to be out in the bigger waves, that might not always be the best choice. Now, we can influence stability. We need to be careful, but we can influence stability. And if we want to improve our stability, which is kind of what we've seen is probably a good thing. That is, if we could lower our center of gravity, we would essentially increase our righting moment for our given angle of heel, and so that would probably have an effect of raising our AVS and lowering that smile that I'd said at the right hand end of the stability curve, lowering that force required to turn a vessel back upright again. And that would all come from just lowering our center of gravity. Now, we need to be super careful because if we do lower our center of gravity, it's going to change how things work on the vessel. It can even have adverse effects on the buoyancy. So we can actually negatively affect it. But in most scenarios, the small things that we would do are just going to change it in small numbers that are acceptable. And one of the biggest things that we see every day, especially on sailing vessels, is the sail plan. So say the boat was probably designed to have a mainsail on the boom and a head sail that either would be hoisted or would be wrapped around the furler. But if you're constantly leaving your furled head sail around the furler, you're actually raising that center of gravity. Whereas if you bring your sail down and only put it up when you're using it, you're actually lowering, you're taking the whole weight of that sail from halfway up your mast and putting it down into your sail locker. And the same goes for your mainsail. If you're having an in-mast furling mainsail, not only do you lose some of the benefits of sail shape, but you're moving that weight of the sail from your boom halfway up your mast. Now, of course, if you're under sail, it doesn't matter. But if you're sitting at anchor or riding out a storm, then yeah, that could have, maybe anchor's not so much of an issue because stability shouldn't be an issue there, but riding out a storm, then yeah, the lower you can get your sails, the more stable your vessel's going to be. Same goes for stowage. And it's not just thinking about stowing things on deck, but it's stowing things like your cans and like all your food provisions, your heavy personal equipment, any bottles of wine or beer. The lower you can get them in your boat, the lower you make your center of gravity. If you put them all up in the top cupboards of your saloon, then you're raising the weight up. That's why our fuel and water tanks are generally beneath our floorboards, or indeed under our bunks. You might have often found that, and we'll get to this in a second, but now that I've started talking about it, I'll just touch on it. You might have often found there's vessels with a starboard tank and a port tank for fuel or water. Well, if you only ever used your starboard tank, and they were quite big tanks, then you're also going to move your center of gravity sideways because you're not evening the distribution across the vessel. So yeah, really, we can influence it without even thinking about it sometimes. Hiking, I don't know if that's quite the right word for it, but I've got a little picture of someone sitting on the side of the vessel here. That's another way that we can shift our center of gravity. Now it's popular in dinghies, but they'll also do it on racing boats as well. And rather than having everybody sit in the middle or sit in the cockpit or sit down the low side, if all the crew move up to the high side, then they'll actually shift the center of gravity of that vessel outwards. Because they've shifted the center of gravity outwards, they've increased the righting moment, meaning that the vessel will actually start to come back upright a little bit, which is even good for increasing our speed as well. So essentially, we're just using our crew as ballast.
Yeah, they need a big crew for that. Hey, one or two people is probably not going to make a difference. So you'll see race boats typically having like quite large crews, and part of this is that, yeah, like Stu's saying, they can be used as ballast and help flattening out the boat.
Also, it's always good to think about. Now, this is maybe something that's more appropriate on a longer voyage. It probably doesn't matter on a little day sail. So this is maybe more aimed at those who are looking to sail offshore building up towards their yacht master, or even potentially going on an adventure sailing trip or holiday. The vessel is probably going to be most stable at the very start of the voyage, because you've loaded up your vessel, you've stashed all your pins and extra equipment as low as you can. You've filled up your fuel tanks, you've filled up your water tanks. But as you go along in your voyage, all these consumables are going to be used, and that's going to allow the COG to rise, because the weight's going to decrease. And that's something to think about. Well, can we make sure that we're trying to use stuff in a nice even manner? So if we're using 2 fuel tanks, can we use fuel from one and then switch to the other and then switch to the other? That could potentially be the way to do it, and it's something you'd have to think about with your vessel, your crew, and your voyage. And it's also a really good point for those who are lucky enough to have water makers on board. Always keep your water tanks full with your water maker, because actually you're increasing your stability by doing that. That small amount of weight loss probably is it's probably not relevant compared to having better stability. Even some of the round the world racing boats, before they had canting keels, that was a keel that would move to change the center of gravity and so increase the righting moment. They would actually use water ballast, and they would pump the water up to the high side to shift their center of gravity and increase their righting moment. So they made the boat heavier, but they made it faster because they made it flatter.
David's saying that we should just drink all the lighter wines first. Yeah. I think it's good advice.
Yeah. Probably leave the stouts and stuff to the end as well, then. They're the heavier beers, aren't they?
Yeah, the spirits can stay on till the end.
We also, and that leads nicely on to dealing with free surface effect. And free surface effect is free to move liquids around a vessel. So that's when you get a big wave splashes over the deck. You've now suddenly put gallons and gallons or liters and liters of water onto your deck. And not only has it then suddenly raised your center of gravity, but it's also moving around. So it's probably moving your center of gravity around constantly while it's doing that. And so that's why along the side of our deck and our tow rails, we've got big drainage holes to get that water out as quickly as possible, because we don't want that water to stay there. We don't want our cockpit to fill with water. The same goes in our bilges as well. We want them dry, because if we've got water in them, while you might point the argument of what I've been putting in the last couple of slides is, oh, well, if we've got more water in our bilge, we're lowering our center of gravity, and that's better. However, if the water's in your bilge and the boat heels, it then pulls the water will then move to the side, and that will shift the center of gravity the way we don't want, and it will decrease our righting moment. Because it's moving as well, if the vessel starts to roll, it can create positive feedback loops, being that the vessel will roll one way, and then after water moves, or whatever it is that's moving, that free surface liquid. So even on larger vessels, it can be like sand or grain or anything like that. It then would create the vessel to move that way, and then all that would slide down the other way, and it'll go that way. And each time, the roll would get greater until it reaches its AVS and goes upside down. So we need to stop this from happening. So we want to keep our bilges dry. We want to keep the water out the deck, and we want to keep our grains of sand and other stuff like that safely in the holes and not moving around. And that's something that happens in our fuel tanks or water tanks as well. So you look at the top picture here. We've got a vessel upright and then a vessel heeled over. The center of gravity is in the same place because the tanks are full and that liquid can't move anywhere. But in the lower picture, the tanks are half full. When it's upright, center of gravity is where it should be. But as soon as the vessel heels, the liquid slides to the side of these tanks It then shifts the center of gravity out to the side, and suddenly we've decreased our righting moment because we've moved our center of gravity towards where the center of buoyancy is acting, and so we've reduced our righting moment. You probably find a lot of older fuel tanks, they should still have them, modern ones as well, but modern ones are becoming a lot more fabricated plastic and fitting around the molds of the hull. But they had what was known as baffles down them, and that was essentially to try and stop the worst of this happening, so that when the vessel did lean over, it kept the fuel or the water in its place. Yeah, a great example of why, if you can, keep those tanks full, because you'll keep your center of gravity in the center of the vessel rather than letting it go off to the side. There's nothing worse than half a full tank, because all you're doing is moving that center of gravity. Now, this is starting to get a little bit more kind of advanced terms, and this is super important for those that are potentially going for yachtmaster, coastal or yachtmaster offshore at some stage, is understanding the difference between list, heel, and loll. Heel is, as we said at the start, it's the result of any external forces causing the vessel to experience a position that's not vertically upright. So as I touched on, it was the wind, but the waves do it as well. And if the vessel then heels over, that's known as heel. And that's caused by external forces. However, if the vessel is at an angle before anything acts on it, then that's not an external force. And that's known as listing. And listing could be a stable position. As you can see here, it's beforehand, it was heeled over, and then maybe an external force acted on it, and then it stopped, and it goes back to that home position, but with a heel on. So it's just a home position that isn't vertically upright, is known as listing. It's quite common on barges with a crane that's maybe offset, and they've not got their load on the other side. So they'll maybe have a list on, but it's perfectly safe as long as that is built into their kind of stability characteristics. I've been on sailing vessels that have a list purely because they've built the vessel with heavier stuff on one side and lighter stuff on another side, such as the galley is all on one side, the heads is on the same side, and then the other side is just the saloon and the chart table, which are much lighter. So yeah, sometimes it's not obvious, but sometimes that will just create a degree or two of list. And yeah, the only way to get around that is to either move weight or to fill tanks accordingly. We're not worried if that's the case, but I guess I'm just pointing it out to say that it doesn't have to be a working commercial vessel to experience list. You know, you will see it on lots of vessels out there. And loll is basically when we have a listed position, but it's actually unstable because it doesn't go back to its home position. And so it might start on this side, it gets acted upon by an external force, which takes it to this side, but it doesn't come back to there. So it's unstable because it doesn't have that stability effect to return to its home position.
Is this kind of like where you get like, you know, like big shipping containers that, you know, slip out of place? Would that fall into that?
I'd say that would probably, yeah, it could do. And essentially the rolling motion is essentially a loll effect. If you've got that free surface effect that creates rolling, could essentially be part of a loll effect. The best example that I can think of at the top of my head at the moment is an iceberg. And the reason being is the center, what happens with the loll is the center of gravity is actually above the metacenter. So the center of gravity is much higher on the vessel. The shape of the vessel or the object, when it heels, has caused the buoyancy force to act upwards, but not enough that it goes, that a vertical line goes above the center of gravity, meaning that line, that vertical line through the center of gravity, is actually comes below it, and you have like a negative meta center, and that would be a loll. So it still stays upright, but it's so unstable. So essentially, you could have it something similar on a ship if they put all the heavy containers on the top and the lower container and the lighter containers on the bottom. They could potentially move their center of gravity too high and create this. Stability choices. So as I was saying, or touching on earlier, it's not always about having the most stable. You also want to think about where you're going to go. So your 45-foot modern wide cruising vessel, that's perfect if we want to sail around the local coastline, the Mediterranean, and not go out too far offshore, because we want good initial stability, because we want to go out there and not scare our family and friends by leaning over too much. But we don't need that ultimate stability where we're going to be going out and thinking we need to survive a storm in this vessel, and if we did turn over, we want to come back upright dead easily, because we're just not going to put ourselves in that position. But if you're going to sail around the world or sail far offshore, then you're thinking, if I get caught out, I want to be as safe as we can. And so that's when you're thinking, maybe I want that vessel with better ultimate stability. So yeah, thinking about what you might expect on your sailing voyages with that boat. And then, of course, thinking about your sail plan and stuff like that. How can you lower that center of gravity with your sail plan? And is that a choice on your vessel? But all vessels, no matter what they're designed for, they're all built to specific codes of standard. And when they're built, they'll be given a category as to what they're designed to do. So in commercial aspects, for instance, we get our vessels coded to how far offshore or how far away from a safe haven we're allowed to sail them. And that's the same for all vessels. They'll get given a category and they'll say, this vessel is suitable for inland waterways, this vessel's situated for riverways, coastal sheltered areas, the start of offshore, larger offshore, and ocean. And they've all got kind of various letters or numbers associated with them. So a vessel is already designed for a certain area. And just finally, just to finish up, let's have a quick look at a couple of case studies where the whole answer was built around stability and what we've just learned about. So we'll have a little look at MAIBs, keel loss, vessels rolling, dinghies capsizing, and lifeboats. So MAIB, the Marine Accident Investigation Branch, they give out reports when there's been vessel accidents. And I had a look at some of these when I wrote this, and the main standout point for me was particularly the findings in the MAIB reports for vessel accidents with fishing vessels were particularly strong on the users, the owner, the crew were unaware of the stability factors of the vessel. So what was happening? They were going out using their vessel, and they were either adding stuff to it or doing stuff with their vessel in a commercial work environment that was causing them to significantly change their stability aspects and making their vessel unstable, either turning it into that loll factor where they'd moved the meta center negative, or potentially free surface, not being aware of that free surface effect, creating rolling motion, or over affecting the changes in buoyancy and center of gravity. Additionally, that then comes into if you've got any kind of free flooding on open vessels. So go away from that picture of a fishing boat and just go into a small little day boat. If you've not got ways for that water to come out of that vessel, as soon as water starts coming in and it's stuck in, that's that free flooding, and you're just going to end up with a vessel sinking. So there needs to be ways for water to escape, and there needs to be ways to stop the water from coming in the first place. And finally, one of the other biggest aspects of, I guess this would be linked to fatalities, was not having life-saving devices that were able to float free. So if the vessel was sinking because it had lost its stability, what you want is your life raft and your life rings and stuff like that to pop back up to the surface so that when you're in the water, you can grab onto them and get in them. But if they're not able to do that by themselves, then they're not coming, unfortunately. And so those who've been on sailing vessels and you've been maybe told, oh, this is our life raft and this is it's HRU, it's hydrostatic release unit, and that allows it to float free. That's exactly why. Some of you who are older than me might remember this. 1985, Simon Le Bon, Duran got drummed to sail it around the world. And in one of the last races before they went around the world, their keel fell off the English coast while doing the Fastnet race. Big news at the time. But yeah, it's a perfect example, and it was the really first high-profile story of it happening, and there's been many since. But all that happened was the keel came off, and as soon as there was no keel, that center of gravity shifted upwards. The whole thing then had a negative righting moment. The boat was on its side in seconds, and 30 seconds later, it was fully upside down. Its mast and everything is still attached there. I can't remember I don't know when this actual picture was taken, but there was 6 people still inside, which they were all rescued. And I think if you look super carefully, a couple of them managed to stay completely dry, and a couple of them are smoking in the picture because they just managed to walk over the side as the vessel went over. Vessels rolling. Another way for a vessel to go upside down, other than it leaning so far over that its righting moment becomes negative, is if the height of the wave is greater than the width of the vessel, then that's a chance that it will turn the boat upside down. It's obviously unlikely to happen in coastal waters, but I mean, even just the other day, I was looking at the forecast, and out beyond the Outer Hebrides, where Charlie is at the moment, there was or is 4-meter waves. So if your boat beam is less than 4 meters, then you are susceptible to that. And this comes back to that having a narrow, deeper drafted vessel. If you've got a really high AVS with a small negative righting moment curve, then it's going to be much easier for the next wave to just roll your vessel the tiniest little bit, and the righting moment will kick in and bring you back upright. Generally, if vessels roll one way, they will generally, you'd expect them to roll back upright. The only reason they wouldn't is if you've lost your keel. And as I touched on when we're talking about the hiking, dinghies capsizing is a perfect example of stability and how we can shift the center of gravity. The crew here, they've jumped up on the dagger board of this dinghy, and they're leaning backwards while holding onto the boat. And so what they've done is they've moved the center of gravity from them sitting inside to them being much, much further down. And that allows them to bring the boat upright. And it's all they're doing. It's not them pulling the boat upright. You can literally stand on the dagger board and the boat will come upright on some of them. All they've done is shifted the center of gravity. Yeah, there's no real work involved in it. And finally, a lot of these offshore lifeboats now, they actually only have positive stability curves. They're built in a way that the stability curve that we were looking at, or that common stability curve that we were looking at earlier on, is always positive. And what actually happens is it looks like an M. So it goes up, reaches its maximum, comes down, then goes back up again, and then comes down again. So no matter what angle of heel you put that vessel at, it just wants to turn back upright. It's just due to its shape and its water integrity with the vessel. That's us. Just very quickly to finish, I just want to go back to these stability curves here. Just while I talked about the lifeboat there, just very quickly with other vessels, catamarans, that AVS point is probably about 90 degrees on a catamaran. So as we look at this picture, it's much further to the left. That is, as soon as it gets to 90 degrees, the catamaran wants to go over. And that's pretty common with a lot of power vessels, open vessels, larger ships and stuff like that as well. The AVS will be quite low. Sailing vessels are unique in the fact that they have much greater AVSs. And if they did turn upside down, there is a chance that they'll come back upright. You turn a catamaran upside down, the chances of turning it back up the right way are ever so slim because the negative part of the righting moment is so big, like the force required. Yeah, it's just so great. So yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Okay, Charlie, when the house bears about 270 degrees.
Information to work out our distance from the lighthouse and use that.
We might be perfectly on track, but if we're not on
Just have
time...
a look, I've got my phone here at the effects it has on our steering compass.
As our echo sound is working, we can find a contour and follow it nicely into port.
Our left hand is pointing towards the centre of the loll.